following podcast is recorded and produced by Emerge, a media creators co-op, in affiliation with the network at bicbp-radio.com.
Question: who is lying to you today? The media? Social media? Big business? Politicians? Actually, it's probably all of them. That led me to create this podcast named They're All Lying to Us. We do research and present findings and opinions on political, social, and cultural topics to inform our communities about what's really going on. You know, stuff that affects everyday American life. We also invite you to share your voice and help us recreate real-life interactions as they were had in the pre-digital era. I'm your host for these conversations. My name is Andy. Welcome everyone to They're All Lying to Us, or as we call it for shorthand here, TALUS. Today's recording date is Thursday, April 25th, 2024. So hope everybody is doing well. If you would like to read more about what we do here at TALUS and some of our other products and things that we have in terms of podcasts and blogs on various topics, please go to our website at www.lyingtous.com. Now, I'm going to head into today's launch of today's topic, which is U.S. funds Ukraine. Final score, democracy 2, Russian disinformation 0. Now, after months of legislative delays, the U.S. House of Representatives finally passed a bill that will provide additional funding to aid Ukraine in its ongoing struggle against Russian aggression. This decision underscores a united Western commitment to uphold democratic values against authoritarian overreach, marking another chapter in America's long-standing foreign policy tradition of supporting democracies worldwide. They're All Lying to Us wonders, what the hell took so long? The U.S. Senate supported more Ukraine funding by a 70-29 vote months ago. Could it be that Russian disinformation was at play and led to this delay? Let's dive a little deeper. And before we get into the Russian disinformation side, let's look at the current state of the war between Russia and Ukraine. Now, Russia invaded Ukraine back in February of 2022, a little over 2 years ago. Reports indicate that the Russian government and its propaganda outlets have openly announced a goal of taking Ukrainian territory and subjugating its government to the Kremlin. As for the battle on the ground, Ukraine has been able to recapture 54% of occupied territory, while Russia still occupies 18% of the country. Ukraine's 2023 counteroffensive efforts have stalled, and Russia seems more entrenched in Eastern Europe. To be able to hold off its much larger attacker, Ukraine has relied upon significant financial support from Europe and the United States. Since early 2022, Ukraine has received about $278 billion in aid, $75 billion of which has come from the United States. Now, Ukraine's 2023 counteroffensive efforts stalled, as mentioned, and Russia seems more entrenched in eastern Ukraine. And probably not coincidentally, the U.S. has stalled in providing more support for the past 6 months, largely due to objections from the Republican-led House of Representatives. Let's take a look at a few quotes from leading U.S. officials to Congress who provide a dire picture of the status in Ukraine should the U.S. not provide further assistance. William Burns, the director of the CIA, said, quote, "I think there is a very real risk that the Ukrainians could lose on the battlefield by the end of 2024, or at least put Putin in a position where he could essentially dictate the terms of a political settlement." The director of national intelligence, Avril D. Haines, said, "It is hard to imagine how Ukraine will be able to maintain the extremely hard-fought advances it has made against the Russians, especially given the sustained surge in Russian ammunition production and purchases from North Korea and Iran." So that's the current status on the ground. Basically, initial Russian push when they started the war in February 22, Ukraine pushed back. 2023, they went on a counteroffensive and got back some of the territory that Russia had gained earlier in the war. And now it seems a little bit stalemated, but leaning towards Russia slowly chipping away at the Ukraine, and certainly their supplies, which were badly needed, and that lends credence to the need for additional U.S. aid. Now, let's take a look at the case against American support. Now, the latest bill to provide $61 billion in additional aid to the Ukraine passed on April 20th by 311 for to 112 against in the House of Representatives. And 110 of those against votes were Republicans. Over in the Senate, the current bill passed by a 79 to 18 margin on April 23rd. And 15 of those 18 no votes coming from Republicans. Now, the last time Congress voted for Ukraine aid and approved it was back in December 2022. So we're pushing about a year and a half since the last time it authorized aid to Ukraine. And in December 2022, the Democrats controlled the House of Representatives. Since that time, opposition to aiding Ukraine has grown from a fringe position to just over half of the House GOP lawmakers. But obviously, support for Ukraine funding is still quite high. Supporting Ukraine and defending itself against Putin's Russia seems to have some strong support from both parties and approximately 75% of Congress. So why are some Republicans against it? Many of them argue that the money should be spent domestically, or that policy changes at the U.S.-Mexico border should take precedence. The problem with that argument is that the Senate did negotiate a Ukraine spending bill, which included beefing up border security back in February. The House refused to even consider that bill at the time. What are some of the other representatives saying about why the Ukraine funding is a bad thing? Senator Mike Lee of Utah criticized the current bill on the basis that we are spending money that we don't have. Others, like hillbilly elegy author and Ohio Senator J.D. Vance, suggest that the Ukraine is destined to lose, so it should assume a defensive posture and negotiate with Putin, conceding some territory in the process. Vance also has indicated that the U.S. has, quote, spread too thin, unquote, in terms of its military defenses. Now, some far-right Republicans may even go further in taking an isolationist view, such as Representatives Matt Gaetz, Jim Jordan, and Marjorie Taylor Greene, who has said that Ukraine aid, quote, puts America last, unquote, and means that, quote, we're ignoring our own people's problems, unquote. So, as TALUS tend to do, we're looking at another aspect of this and wondering if Russian disinformation is increasing opposition to support of the Ukraine here in the United States. Well, on April 8th, just a couple weeks ago, the Washington Post published an investigation into an extensive and coordinated Russian campaign to influence U.S. public opinion to deny Ukraine the aid, including reporting on documents showing Russian government involvement. So the Russian government was actively involved in these disinformation campaigns to discourage or stop the U.S. from giving aid to Ukraine. Let me read you a quote from that summary, from that article. In an ongoing campaign that seeks to influence congressional and other political debates to stoke anti-Ukraine sentiment, Kremlin-linked political strategists and trolls have written thousands of fabricated news articles, social media posts, and comments that promote American isolationism, stir fear over the United States' border security, and attempt to amplify U.S. economic and racial tensions. Now, such efforts may have an impact on American public opinion, as increasing numbers believe the U.S. is providing too much aid to the Ukraine. Some Republican lawmakers also believe Russian disinformation is affecting the American public. House Foreign Affairs Committee head Michael McCall said, Russian propaganda has made its way into the US, unfortunately, and it's affected a good chunk of my party's base. Representative Michael R. Turner of Ohio said on CNN's State of the Union, quote, "We see directly coming from Russia attempts to mass communications that are anti-Ukraine and pro-Russia messages, some of which we even hear being uttered on the House floor," unquote. And just a few days ago, CNN reported that hard-right Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene of Georgia, quote, suggested U.S. military funding would go to Ukrainian Nazis on her X account, repeating a false claim about Ukraine pushed by Putin, unquote. Another Republican lawmaker, retiring Representative Ken Buck of Colorado, was more blunt. She, Marjorie Taylor Greene, is just mouthing the Russian propaganda and really hurting American foreign policy in the process, unquote. Buck has referred to Marjorie Taylor Greene as Moscow Marjorie, a phrase that was also picked up by the New York Post on its cover page, along with a matching image. Now, conservative media more generally seems to be piling on Taylor Greene, even calling her, quote, an idiot, unquote. That was a look into Russian disinformation and how it may have found its way into the mainstream of American public and politicians. But let's take a look at and I'd like to provide here an opinion on the case for why we should support Ukraine. Now, just as a refresher, Ukraine was one of the republics which made up the former Soviet Union. After the Soviet Union disbanded, Ukraine became an independent nation, a status that was agreed upon by Russia and the United States. Russia continued to have influence, being the next door neighbor to Ukraine, but Ukraine seemed to be drifting closer to the US and the rest of Europe right up until Russia's commencement of a military campaign in the Ukrainian Crimea region back in 2014. However we got to that point, the US and Ukrainian alliance became the reality, with Ukrainian freedom from Russian influence as a key driver. Although not meaning to have Ukraine be another square in a Cold War chessboard battle between the US and Russia, that has seemed to be the case. In a sense, it is one part of the broader global battle for the US against its greatest challengers and enemies, Russia and Communist China. Russia has continued to seek influence in places like Syria, and more recently in African countries like Niger, which has led to the overthrow of a US-friendly democratic government there. And though Russia is no longer communist, it features an authoritarian government, much like China's, with Putin in charge. Clearly, Putin does not seem to be a friend of democracy, as shown by his attempts and apparent success in orchestrating the murder of political foes like Alexander Navalny. The concerns of Ukraine falling to Russia mainly revolve around a sort of old-school anti-communist domino theory, in which Russia will not stop with Ukraine. Next on the horizon might be NATO members like Poland, and a possible escalation to a larger European war with US troops involved. In the interim, the failure of the US to support an ally and a young democracy in Ukraine could make it appear as a sign of weakness, giving hesitation to other allies the US has pledged to support, and the proverbial green light to Russia to further expand its influence, and giving the same green light to China as well, for example, with Taiwan. As the world is even more globally connected today than it was 80 to 100 years ago in the lead up to World War II, a reversion to isolationism seems imprudent. Moreover, America's ability to pull back from being the leading global superpower with a clear view of the resulting New World Order, an order which does not negatively affect us nor our allies, might be difficult. In other words, we're kind of stuck with it. So with that as the summary of the current topic, I'm going to turn over and ask our producer, Rich, to join for a little discussion as we enter the download phase of the show.
Good afternoon.
Rich, how are you today?
I'm okay.
Good. I don't know how closely you've been following the political back and forth around this recently, but here we are with. It's been going on for quite some time. Actually, the funding was originally contemplated in the last budget bill, that would have been 2024 budget, fiscal 2024 budget, at the end of September and early October. It was punted on, and then ever since that time, they've been trying to come up with something. Now, in
Right.
the Senate side, they went off and did this bill. There was like 3 senators involved, at least one or two, at least one Republican I know, and one Democrat in the three, and they went off and put together this bill because in October, the House had said, we're not doing this unless we take out border security too. So they went off and negotiated this big bill that had border security in it too. Maybe not quite as tight as and strict as many Republicans would want, but it was a concession from where Democrats have been traditionally on the issue, and would have tightened down the border somewhat and provided more funding for it. So that was the bill that got passed by 70 to 29, I believe I said, in the Senate back in early February. And then the House went kind of cold turkey on it, and it just sat there. For whatever reason recently, maybe it's some of the reports of kind of how dire the situation is there in Ukraine. Maybe there's some effect of spillover of dealing with, fear around China tinkering with Taiwan, and now we got the whole TikTok thing, which is also included in this bill. And also, there was another event just a few weeks ago. It didn't get a lot of press where, like, the Russians apparently hacked into some small, I think it was a Texas or Oklahoma community. They tapped into their water supply system and shut down the water for several hours and things like that. So maybe those kind of risks and threats made us reconsider finally a second time. But it's been about 6 months since they took up the funding, and it's finally went through. And from what the Ukrainians and other American analysts are telling us, in the government at least, it's not a minute too soon.
Yeah. Everything you've said is, I'm kind of pretty, I'm pretty up to date on most of that. Um, I definitely think that we should be supporting Ukraine. I don't agree with any situation where we, like this, this isolation concept, this whole thing, like, oh, we got to take care of our own. I don't believe for a second that if we weren't spending this money to help support Ukraine, that it was going to go and lower our taxes or something like that. Like, I'm not so naive. It was going to get done. The cynic in me tells me, this finally got done because enough corporations that make weapons, who get to replenish the stockpiles that we're giving, because from what I saw from the press conferences, we're giving Ukraine a lot of stuff we already have, and then we're going to buy new things for ourselves. So it's kind of like, your daughter needs a new car, so you give her your old one, and then you get a new car. So it's kind of like that kind of feel to it. But I do think it's important. I think that it's important that we support Ukraine, because I think it really hampers Russia's interest in trying to see how far they can get away with bringing back, the Soviet Union part two, so to speak. I think, which is Putin's goal to some extent.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. It seems that way.
And to the bills that didn't pass, it's ironic to me, because I'm not a big fan of the current, House, the speaker, but he's actually done better than McCarthy did in terms of actually getting some things passed. He was willing to reach out to some Democrats to get things done. His own party some fringe members of his own party really threatened him. And it's kind of funny because I think McCarthy was so nervous about that he just gave in to them. Where the new guy was just kind of like, okay, I'm not gonna. No, I'm not. And then he kind of did what he needed to do with the former president, who seems to like this guy, at least this week. And it really pissed off those fringe people like, Taylor Marjorie, because she's really in the last week and a half lost a lot of clout. She had a lot of clout 2 weeks and months ago. And she was really, I think she dragged it, as the kids would have said when I was a teacher. And now she's kind of like ostracized herself, and she's no longer flavor of the month. And even to the point, like Trump said something like she needs to stop, and all of a sudden she was quiet. So after that bill passed, they were trying to get her like, well, you said that if they passed it, you were going to call for Johnson to be removed. And she said, well, I think everybody's got to go home and talk to their constituents, and then we'll see. Which her saying, well, no, I'm not going to, because she knows she doesn't have the votes. So, and the other thing is that with that slim majority, if she was also apparently threatened by some Republicans that are just fed up with her and said, if you go after him, we're going to resign. And then we won't even be in the majority anymore. The Democrats there'd be more Democrats actively in the House than Republicans. I don't know if that threat was real, but I think she listened to it. Yeah. The point I made about all of that is that's why the Ukraine wasn't funded, because there was so much politics being played. And I think it wasn't about really supporting Ukraine. It's about, trying to stay in favor with Trump, who seems to be, not friends, but, allied in many ways with Putin on things. And they wanted to keep Trump and Putin happy. So they were fighting this. And then for some odd reason, like whether it was their donors for their campaigns or public sentiment or enough phone calls or whatever, everybody changed their tune.
Yeah, it was a pretty quick shift. Now, as far as, inside the bill, there's some $90+ billion. It's 61 of which goes to Ukraine. There's funding for Israel, and also funding that goes into humanitarian aid to Gazans. And then there's another tranche that goes to related to Taiwan. And that's all in the bill. And then there's another piece which kind of went along. I don't know if they were technically done as separate bills, but they were all kind of processed through as one chunk ultimately. That is something we talked about here a few weeks ago, which was the TikTok ban, as they call it. But basically it's the TikTok has to sell in 9 months, or the Chinese government's interest has to be sold within 9 months, or then it will be banned. So that all went through at once. Now, the interesting thing about just in the much of the 90 billion, which is all the military support to the various countries, a lot of that goes to, there was an article, at least one article that talked about all the different places in all the military defense contractors that benefit from that. And of course, the people, the workers that work there also benefit too, promotes their jobs and things like that. Some local economies, they're in multiple states. And they were talking about how even, in the districts where the 100+ some odd Republicans who voted against it, there are benefits going to a lot of those defense contractors and the people that work there and the communities by virtue of this. So I guess on a good news, if it makes us feel good a little bit, the money's mostly being spent here domestically, and supporting industry here. I guess there's some question as to whether or not, how, we're good at war as an industry. And
war is good for business.
Yeah, it's good for business. So you can question us about that's the path we want to stay on.
War is good for business.
It is.
Yeah.
It is.
Unfortunately, there's a ton of conspiracy theories about why, about 9/11 and the Iraq War and all that stuff. All wag the dog conspiracies back during Clinton and all those things, which it all comes back to those organizations that benefit whenever we go to war, and they're huge donors on both sides of the aisle. And it is the way of the world. I mean, unfortunately it is. And you'd be naive to think that there isn't a component of why these wars happen and we don't, that are related to, just this influence by the same reason why Israel has a ton of influence in our government. Weapons companies have a huge amount of interest. Boeing has too much influence. Like there's too many companies that have too much influence. And I do and honestly think that there was enough people that really felt that we did need to do something to help Ukraine.
Yeah,
Most
I
people
think
don't
so.
like Russia. We don't like when you see the footage of what Russia's done to the cities in Ukraine, attacking water supplies. Like I mean, that type of stuff, that type of attacking infrastructure, it always drives me crazy. I watch a lot of World War II stuff, and they tried to, and back then, even when you had like bombs and you were just looking out a little window and hope that you hit them. There was always this understanding that you tried to avoid bombing cultural sites and things that the regular people needed, as opposed to bombing an airbase or a military, weapons manufacturing plant or a train rail that was moving weapons to the front. But they tried to avoid like water plants and farms and like even cities as much as they could. Um, I don't know. Like I think that Russia thought that they were going to do this quickly, and they thought that I think they thought they could get away with it, and it just didn't work. It's kind of backfired on Putin an awful lot, I think.
You would think in the long run, I think Russia's run into the problem that all the big powerful countries run into when they go into these battles.
When it comes
Outside.
right down to it, anytime, and you could pick a war, you go, if you're the invading force and you go into somebody's land, those people are going to fight a lot harder than you realize.
Right.
That's the story of the Revolutionary War. That's the story of, trying to invade Afghanistan. I mean,
For the Russians and the Americans.
You're fighting for your survival versus a guy who's a soldier and it's his job.
Right.
And that is, I think, ultimately the problem that Russia has. I don't feel like there's enough people in the Russian military, the average soldiers and commanders, that think that this is justified, but they have to because they have no choice.
Yeah.
Well, Russia or Ukraine's like, this is our livelihood, and now they're just pissed, and
Right.
they're a tough group of people.
Yeah. Yeah, it's all kind of interesting. I thought the one this JD Vance guy who's talking about how like Americans military spread too thin, and like we're running out of supplies or something like that, and I thought that was a little bit ridiculous and
I didn't understand
disingenuous. I
that.
mean, if we had to push the button, we could shift the flow to another location or for our own purposes, number one. But number two, I think a lot of this stuff it's a good test of the system to see if we can expand production and things like that. It's kind of like a dry run for if we ever needed to do it.
We
And
can, I mean,
the
military industrial complex in the United States. Yeah.
And it's kind of like too, as well as like a lot of this weaponry. I think when you put it into live play, I think we learn. We watch and learn from what actually happens on the ground and how this stuff functions in real world, and I think it also leads to different adaptations and uses of weapons when you get to actually see it in real world.
Most of what you do nowadays in war, especially like if you're not in a ground assault, which is not the first step anyway. It's all being done by drones and carpet bombing and stuff, and you're hundreds of miles away from the site. It's not, again, you're not bombing Berlin with B-27s in 1944.
Oh yeah, I remember watching the documentaries and even movies about the US through the pilots basically with a joystick, and they're in Nevada fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan.
I'm crazy into World War II, that time period. And when you watch like the battle, I don't think there's ever been a larger military force than the invasion of Normandy. When you consider the ground assault stuff and the troops and the carriers and the Navy and the Air Force, and there's pictures of it, and there's film, like John Ford was around, like there was several movie makers that were involved and captured incredible film that is like, you're never going to ever see that type of force of people and devices ever again. It's just when war's not done that way anymore. Like it's just not like even look last week when Iran sent all those drones into Israel and the Iron Dome, and they were shooting them down and everything. But that's what things look like now. I mean, that's really what I mean. Then you got a missile coming in that's from 400 miles away, and it's more accurate, than our GPS satellites we have in our phones. It's so saying that our military spreads through thin. I don't believe for a second.
Right. The interesting part, and something that's kind of a focus of what we do on this podcast, is all about how media, social media, and communications is dividing us. And of course, the name of the podcast is "They're All Lying to Us." And I thought the interesting detail I was able to find in my research on this topic was that the scale and scope of this Russian disinformation campaign. And the interesting thing is that I encounter people in my own life. I see things. If occasionally I'll turn into like one of those call-in shows on C-SPAN, the Washington Journal, and you'll have people on there, and invariably you will hear people, and this applies somewhat to both sides of the aisle, although a lot of the articles suggest that Republicans are more prone to believing this, according to some studies and things that were done. I don't know about the veracity of it, but it happens on both sides of the aisle, where these things certain things start to get spouted. You hear it kind of resonate, and it's the type of thing that when you hear it enough, I mean, there was one study that was done that people who they like exposed them more to like Fox News, and then they believed more of the stuff that they heard on Fox News. It started to change their minds and opinions. And then there's sources of information that are, also may rebroadcast things that are questionable. And then on social media, that can, there's no real filter on that at all. Actually, what you get on a Fox News or even an MSNBC or whatever, some of that stuff is a little bit filtered, but there is that kind of that cycle. And I would hear these things. I mean, I even the beginning with this Ukraine thing, you hear about the Ukrainian Nazis, from regular, just people you're talking about and going out, whatever, at the supermarket or whatever. And they're like, oh yeah, well, they have all those Nazis there and all those other stuff. And it's like, oh, really? Well, it's like, well, that's, I guess every country has some remnant of that, but, Zelensky's actually Jewish. So I'm kind of wondering how that Nazi thing really plays out there, since their president is Jewish. And then you find out Putin's pushing it too. And you just, it just goes into that whole thing that it's so difficult to filter what we are exposed to.
And some of those elected officials that you mentioned, they were outwardly posting and talking about those same things,
Right?
Things that were that literally were Putin talking points, almost word for word. Like they were getting talking points from Putin's office.
And again, maybe not knowingly, but it's all stuff that's coming through their feed with the people that are on their staffs, and they're filtering this stuff out because there's so much of it. And it's just, when you see that report where they're posting thousands of items, they talk about in detail about how, somebody, like, they would create, specifically from a Kremlin Russian government agency is promoting this stuff. And they're advising, they create a profile of somebody in a metropolitan, lives in the suburbs of, whatever city, USA, and they describe themselves as such. And then they're reposting these specific things, all designed to drive us to hate each other, to mislead us on things. And it's just, it's part of that ongoing struggle. Even if you remember that Russian general guy, that Prigozhin, he was the one who, at one point, they thought he was going to head to Moscow and pull off a coup. Well, he actually worked for this group, the Wagner group, and they had all these, running all these secret military missions in Syria before supporting Syria before that whole Syrian debacle in 2015, the Syrian civil war. They're off in Russia and Africa, doing all these other kind of things and running all these operations. Right. And they also ran a disinformation unit as well. And you see what happened when he turned his back. All of a sudden, he ended up blowing up in a plane.
He was dead within a couple months. And
yeah,
I mean, he
fell out of window. It happens.
He's like, he might as well be working for Boeing.
Flying a 737 MAX 9.
I won't get into my conspiracy theories on one of our.
There was that case a month or two ago about the guy who was going to testify and he supposedly committed suicide. Going to testify against Boeing, and I think it was in South Carolina. And now they're actually, just on another note, I saw a piece the other day about the families. There's some law that enables the families to be part of, participate somehow in information about prosecuting. There was a possible prosecution of Boeing executives, and that was kind of scuttled or whatever, and the victims of the crimes are supposed to be able to have a say or be informed of the activities. Well, the whole thing got dismissed before they ever had a say. So apparently that's coming back though, and some of the victims are trying to get a voice again and trying to see if they can bring criminal charges against some Boeing execs for their loved ones that died in one of those 737 MAX 8 crashes. But that's just a side note. But the whole thing, again, on information and things like that, you've brought it up in a couple different ways, the power of corporations in all of this structure as well.
Two things that have changed a lot of this, and it affected, because obviously we've talked about Israel last week, and and how it's getting worse now in college campuses. And I'm sure we might cover that at some point. But when you think about what's going on in Gaza and what's going on in Ukraine, the two biggest changes are these are the first wars, huge, like in terms of scale, that the combatants and the victims all have cell phones and they have social media, and we are seeing so much of what in live time from people. Like, it's not fake, it's not AI. There's too much of it. There's not enough AI generation to do this stuff, to show us what's going on, like in Ukraine when Russia attacks, and what happening in Gaza and what's happening, there's so much footage, and even like guys in the field, that are running up and, attacking the Russian tanks, like Ukrainian soldiers, and they're running up. It looks like footage from one of my kids' video games. Like, we're seeing it. So it's such a different, like when you think about like the cameras we had during the Gulf War, for example, and now like that's nothing, that's compared to what the amount of footage and stuff that we're seeing because of social media, that you can go on so many sites now and bypass your media. And I do this pretty regularly. I have a bunch of sites that I go to and find stuff, and I'm on X a lot just to see some things, and I try to fact check it to the best of my ability. But that has changed people's perceptions, and I think that helped get Ukraine and Gaza, humanitarian aid. Otherwise, I don't think it would have happened.
Yeah. There's a lot more when you can see it firsthand, unfiltered. War is hell.
You're seeing. It looks. You see some of the stuff in Ukraine, some of these cities, and I can't remember the cities' names, but they look like that. They look like after you bombed Berlin, or some of the places in Holland they got bombed. During the battle. Was that the Battle of the Bulge, or when the?
It could have been. Yeah, I lost my World War II history there, but yeah. Dresden bombings were the most notable, I think, in Germany.
Rescued them, although they, there's funny stories about that. But it reminds you of like there's the buildings are just collapsed. You can see into like what was a bedroom or something, and that's what it looks like in Ukraine. Except this is today, and this happened this morning, and you're watching it live, and the guy's wearing a sweatshirt that you could buy online.
His Adidas sweatshirt.
It's so different, and I think we all. I mean, I've been to Europe. You've traveled. I think you've been to Europe too, right?
Yep.
So it's many people don't look at other countries the way we used to because we don't see them. Now we've been there, we see them. We got a guy, we're following a TikTok guy or whatever, a girl, whatever. So we have so much more. We're still global, but we do feel like we can reach out and have people and talk to people in these countries and follow their socials and so it humanizes Ukraine. And even the term "the Ukraine" is a weird term that was started by Russia and the Soviet Union many years ago to kind of not let Ukraine be a people, but be an area. So it used to be called the Ukraine as opposed to Ukraine.
Right.
And you're not supposed to say the Ukraine because it's insulting to the people from Ukraine. Like, oh, we're not the Ukraine. We're Ukraine. We're Ukraine. We're not a region. We're
no
a people.
preposition needed.
But that was a misinformation by the Soviet Union, even actually going back to, like World War II. Ukraine's always been in play. It's always one of those areas that's like Poland, Czechoslovakia, like there are those lands there. Oh, the other thing I wanted to mention is it's really two things that have happened. Some of the crap that's happened in the last few years has made NATO kind of toughen up, in my opinion. NATO is not just waiting for us to show up and do our job. They're starting to jump in and do more things, and getting more countries to be part of NATO, and also spending significant of their own resources to protect themselves and not just waiting for us to do it. And I think that's good because I think it needs to be a coalition. It feels more legit when it's 20 countries that are giving aid and weapons and planes and training to people in the Ukrainian people, as opposed to just, oh, here comes America again.
Right.
Britain.
Yeah. There was reports that I read as well that how much, and I mentioned, I mean, there's more funding coming from Europe than there is from the United States. And some countries are giving a lot more as a relative to their GDP than the US is toward this effort. So there is a broad coalition there. And I think a lot more of their money goes to, I think they've pledged some money to like rebuild and reconstruct.
That's fine,
and it's also more humanitarian type aid.
As long as they're part of the process.
Yes,
I mean, NATO is obviously, we started NATO. Like, let's be honest, the United States wanted NATO, and that's why we submit. That's why we pay a lot, because it was kind of our idea. And
when you pay, you get to decide where you get to go to dinner, right? So,
right. and so, but now the right quite often complains, they should be paying. They don't pay their bills, which is totally a fake thing. But the fact it takes that argument away that we should be helping Ukraine because NATO doesn't help. That's a talking point. Well, NATO is helping now. So that eliminated another talking point, which took those guys that are on the fence about helping, gave them the outside. Well, Germany and
it's
France
pushed a couple of the Scandinavian countries to join, including Sweden. I think recently it was one of them that were recently approved as NATO members. Now, back in like 2008, Ukraine had applied to be in NATO, and they were refused. I think part of the refusal, I think it was the UK and France primarily objected. And I think part of it was they kind of didn't want to piss off the Russians.
Right.
And the Russians have used this, and some other analysts have suggested that, well, the US was by pushing them more towards us and all those other things, we've also made Russia feel uneasy with them on their border and everything else. So I don't buy that entire. I mean, I buy it that they might have felt uneasy, but it's kind of hokey. Also, in 2014, when this whole Crimea thing started, a lot of the back and forth was around how connected Ukraine was going to be to the EU. Right. And they restarted kind of this long process of applying for admission to the EU shortly after this last February 2022
And Russia
invasion
doesn't
from
want to
Russia
feel
started.
isolated. And I feel like this was a test case. And there are people within the Russian government that truly believe that Ukraine is part of Russia. But then this is an old.
And there are parts that are Russian speaking.
Yes, yes, well, yeah.
Make no mistake. The
Yeah,
part of the
there's
regions that they occupy.
right. And the other thing I think that's a good point that you brought up earlier also is the fact that Ukraine is an interesting test case for what's going to happen in China invading who they want to invade in a couple of years. They want to see how does the world react to a country just being annexed or whatever they call it, annexed. Yeah. If they can get away with it. Yeah. And I think that's kind of why they're kind of testing the waters to see well, they got away with it. Let's see if we can get away with it,
Yeah, absolutely. So
that's a completely different weird one, but
yeah, I mean, it's good. I think we had a good conversation. Hopefully everybody was able to get a little bit more information and background on what's going on over there and why I guess we kind of agree at this point that the funding sort of makes sense. It'd be nice if there was kind of a known end date in sight, but part of this might be not unlike what Reagan kind of did with Star Wars and all that stuff in the 80s, which is spend the crap out of it and kind of push the Soviet Union into financial disarray, and that might be part of it. Yeah, we just wear down the Russians.
Yeah, outspend them.
Yeah, and I think in the good news, I'm going to head into my closing and talk about how the good news of all this is that I think of all the things we were able to beat back with this, I think was Russian disinformation. So in our final segment, the reboot. And this section I entitle Democracy Wins Twice and Russian Disinformation Loses. Domestically, here in the US, Russian disinformation efforts were unable to stop the majority of the American people and a supermajority of Congress from providing aid to Ukraine. Democracies in Europe and Ukraine won as well, empowering them to fight for self-rule without conceding to a militarily threatening neighbor. Now, make no mistake, disinformation campaigns by Russia and/or China can be powerful in shifting opinions of both the public and government representatives. The failsafe against such incursions continues to be a strong democracy. As a system of government, democracy may not be as efficient as a simple dictatorship. But as the old saying often attributed to Winston Churchill goes, quote, Americans will always do the right thing, only after they've tried everything else, unquote. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. Again, you can read the blog about this and see our other podcast episodes, get links to them. You can look for us also on Spotify, on YouTube, and find the podcast there and the blogs themselves you can find at www.lyingtous.com. This is Andy signing off on April 25th, 2024. We'll see you next time. Thanks.